£10 billion. That is how much money the government wasted in the dash for PPE, personal protective equipment, for healthcare workers during the pandemic. And we got that number today from the latest report from the UK official inquiry into COVID. And that's what we'll be discussing on this episode of Newscast. Well, the person who's been following the COVID inquiry for many, many years is health reporter Jim Reid. Hello, Jim.
Hi, Adam.
Here we are again.
The fifth time.
Well, I was going to say, which module is this? Module number 5.
Number 5.
Out of 10.
Halfway through.
Whoa, so quite a milestone then for
it
the COVID inquiry.
It is.
So this one is about a subject that everyone will remember from the pandemic, which was the supply of PPE, personal protective equipment. Where do you want to start with what Baroness Hallett has found?
I mean, the headline that everyone's jumping on is the cost. And weirdly, we knew to a certain extent some of these numbers anyway, but I think there's a power in hearing them repeated by the chair of the public inquiry. So almost £10 billion of taxpayers' money wasted, she said. That's obviously a fair bit of money. When you take into account everything that was spent on PPE, on those lateral flow tests we're all using at the time, on ventilators, the bill comes to £42 billion. And to put that into some sort of perspective, the core defence budget for the UK is about 68 billion. You can build a new NHS hospital for about £1 billion. So it's an awful lot of money.
So it's kind of 10 hospitals worth.
Wasted.
And when she says wasted in what ways?
So in two main ways. One is, in the end, they just bought too much of the stuff. And you can see how this happened because, and this goes back to planning, we always talk about planning. The right plans, she argues, were just not in place. We had something called the pandemic stockpile. Now, this is actually in a giant warehouse in Merseyside, and it was set up for a flu pandemic. And it was meant to get us through at least 15 weeks of a pandemic. And then, the idea is you replenish it as it goes along. It got us through, at best, maybe a month. So well short of what we needed to do. Plus, the stuff they had in this pandemic stockpile wasn't up to scratch. So the masks for England didn't work. Some of the masks for Scotland, they didn't have the right respirator masks that doctors and nurses needed. So there was that. And then there was this incredible bit, Adam. They talk about this 100 days from sort of February through to sort of the early summer 2020, when they were just desperate to get hold of this stuff. And the problem was the whole world was desperate to get hold of this stuff at the same time. So there's a really good example they gave in the evidence, where at one point, and this is actually a bit later, but to do with testing kits, where the Foreign Office in Beijing were getting in touch with their counterparts in London and saying, look, we can buy all these testing kits, but you need to do the deal over the weekend. And they delayed doing the deal. They went back on Monday morning and they went, the US have bought all the testing kits.
Right.
And they went, what, like every testing kit? They went, yep, every testing kit in China. And that's the kind of thing they were dealing with at the time. You remember those pictures of like planes landing.
And people haggling on the runway, yeah. And as usual with lots of the conclusions of this inquiry, it boils down to, as you were suggesting there not being a proper plan, so that people hadn't thought through what some of the challenges were going to be. They hadn't tested that plan to see if it would survive contact with the real world. And we ended up with this. Yeah,
I mean, they say, and they do make the point, that it's better to purchase in that situation too much PPE in a pandemic than too little. You kind of want to make sure that you can get this stuff through to the front line. But this isn't, in the great words of a sort of understated language they use in these reports, it would clearly have been better if supply had been calibrated more closely with demand. What they mean there is panic is maybe too strong a word, and they didn't use that word in the report, but there was just a situation when they were desperately competing for this stuff, and they were willing to spend whatever it took to replenish supplies, and they bought stuff that in the end they didn't particularly end up using or need, whether it was gowns that weren't the right, they did a £122 million deal, £122 million for gowns. They all were not up to scratch. They couldn't be used in the NHS. So that was part of it. And the other part of it was just buying too much stuff and having this glut, which they ended up either burning, sending to landfill, or having to donate to charities and so on.
And one of the things that became infamous during that period was the so-called VIP lane, where basically people who had contacts with MPs or government ministers or members of the House of Lords sort of went to the top of the email inbox if they were offering to help. And Baroness Hallett and her team say quite a lot about this.
Yes, I would say this is probably one of the most controversial policies of the whole pandemic. And it's worth pointing out, and they say this in the report, that no other country other than England had this in the world. So Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland didn't go on there, and they looked to see if any other country had a comparable system. They did not. So what was happening was that if you were not just connected to a minister, but also to an MP, a civil servant, a member of the House of Lords, you could essentially get your offer prioritised and potentially fast-tracked. And you've got to remember, this was at a time when speed of doing these deals was really key. So actually getting it fast-tracked was a huge advantage for some of these companies. Now, Hallett does say that she could not identify cronyism or corruption on the part of ministers and officials when these deals were finally awarded in the final contracts. But she does say it created this unfairness, she puts it, within the government system. She said it wasn't intended, but it was inherently biased towards those with connections to government. And this is quite a strong quote. She says, it heightened the risk of abuse, it undermined public trust in the UK government itself, and it should not ever be repeated.
And so, it wasn't corruption, it wasn't cronyism, but it was a bad thing to have done in retrospect, is what she's saying.
Yeah, exactly. And Michael Gove actually has been tweeting about this in the last couple of hours or so. Someone made the point on, I think it was a Sky News tweet that he was responding to, and he said actually it wasn't cronyism or corruption. Dame Heather Hallett found no evidence of that on the part of ministers or officials, but he does say mistakes were made, honest mistakes. I take full responsibility of that, but he describes the allegations of corruption as nonsense. Now, I think other people, campaigners and so on, would have to take a different view on that. You know, it depends what your definition of corruption is. She did come back, though, and say that she could find no evidence of that, at least in the final contracts that came through.
I was just doing a quick Control F on the report there for the phrase Dunkirk spirit, because I thought that was an interesting bit, because I remember when ministers were saying, and I suppose it was the opposite of the VIP lane, it was saying, if you have a company that you think you could help deliver some PPE, let us know. And that seemed like quite a kind of public-spirited, crowdsourcing thing to do. There's a section in the inquiry talking about how actually it ended up being a total nightmare for the civil servants, because they got 3,000 offers in the first week, and then they were getting 300 new offers from people every 24 hours, and they were basically just deluged, and so few of those offers turned into actual contracts for providing stuff. So it seemed like a good idea at the time, let's get everyone to help, all hands on deck, but actually it ended up just being a massive bad idea.
I mean, this is the thing, because this VIP lane, they couldn't really, there's a slight suggestion in the report, but they couldn't really work out where it had come from. There wasn't a piece of paper that said, let's create this VIP lane. It was exactly as you say. I think Matt Hancock, when he was Health Secretary, I think it was in one of his briefings when he was at the podium, gave what was called a call to arms. So it was like, come and give us your PPE, provide your PPE. And of course, that did generate some I'd imagine, some very big, reputable offers. It also meant that anyone that was kind of literally knitting kind of aprons for people and so on got in touch with the government.
To help,
and that created this situation. There was so much to kind of get through that they had to find a way of sorting through the chaff to get to the decent offers, which is why you ended up with a system like this. But you could make the argument that, you know, every country in the world was to a certain extent under similar pressures, but England in particular was the only place apparently where this went on.
Now, there's a section of this report that's kind of missing, or is going to come out at a later date, because it refers to PPE MedPro, which was the company that was associated with Michelle Mone, formerly Baroness Mone, and her husband Doug Barrowman, which is currently being investigated by the National Crime Agency. Why is that not in here?
Well, I've got to talk to you about the background to this. So this was about this time, actually February, March last year, when they were taking evidence for this bit of the report. And we were told that this section, or this bit of evidence about PPE MedPro, which is the company, would have to be held behind closed doors. So in the end, they got 5 journalists in, myself and 4 others from the national newspapers, and we did get to watch all this evidence. It was I can tell you, it was 3 officials involved in some of these procurement decisions from the Department of Health. But we were under reporting restrictions, and we still are. So we cannot report.
Almost like reporting a trial. The judge says you can't put this information out.
It's exactly what it was like. I think it's a slightly different bit of the law they're using, but essentially it was an order from Baroness Hallett saying you can't talk about this. So yes, I've got all my notes from that day, but I can't talk to you about it at all. And there's a whole section, chapter, I think it's 5A of this report, is entirely blank and redacted out, because they cannot They cannot go into this while there is this ongoing investigation from the National Crime Agency, which is still being pursued at the moment. Now, at the time, Baroness Moan was particularly critical of them doing this. She called for this to not take place at all, but it did go ahead anyway. And what they're saying is they will eventually publish this evidence, but only after the conclusion of every possible criminal proceeding that might happen. So not necessarily a trial. And we should point out that Baroness Moan and Mr. Barrowman both say that they did no wrong. There was no wrongdoing going on here, and no one's been charged at the moment in relation to PPE MedPro. But they say that no evidence can come out until the end of any possible criminal trial, which could include any appeal. So we could be like talking years, Adam, further down the line.
Yeah. And what does the inquiry say about linking the lack of PPE and the chaos and the waste with the safety of healthcare workers?
It was more vocal than I thought it would be on that, but you had to sort of read between the lines of the
That's
report.
why I'm asking you, because I read a lot of it and I'm still not clear what Baroness Hallett thinks about that. It's like, did doctors and nurses get ill or maybe even die because they were having to use bin bags instead of proper gowns, for example?
So what happens is they publish the report, and then Baroness Hallett speaks for, I think it's roughly 15 minutes. And in that speech, she did use the word at risk. It was, again, you had to sort of read between the lines slightly, but she did say that both NHS staff and care home staff as well, and the people they were caring for were put at risk by poor PPE decisions. And then she went on to talk about those decisions. So I think you can kind of draw the line there as well. So I do think that that is her view. The reason why she hasn't gone into it, I think, in so much detail is because there was an earlier phase of the inquiry which looked specifically at the impact on health staff. And there they went into a lot of detail about the types of masks that people were given, whether they were correct or not. So as per usual,
this was more a report about logistics and supply chains and provision rather than the people in the NHS.
It was, but she does say that the staff as a result were poorly protected because of some of these decisions that were made. In particular, the speed of getting some of this material, PPE, masks, gowns and so on, out to the front line was much slower than it needed to be. And she certainly suggests that could put people at risk.
Right. I know this is a huge report. It's months and months of evidence, a lot of your life. Is there anything else we haven't covered yet that we've missed out?
In this
I feel those
are
the main headlines. I just want to make sure we've done it justice. All your hard work.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the one thing that I think is quite interesting is this, and she makes recommendations about this, is this PPE stockpile, because it goes back to, we talked about this before, the planning for a pandemic. I think ministers were probably sitting there thinking, you know, we've got this one covered. We've got this huge stockpile up in Merseyside. We can get the army involved to distribute it around the country. We should last us for 15 weeks. That should get us through to the summer, probably through the pandemic. You know, kind of really tapping themselves, you know, passing themselves.
Well, because there was a lot of that around the whole pandemic preparedness, wasn't it? Ministers say even now, we were told by officials, by external bodies, by international bodies that we'd done a good job to get ready.
I mean, some of the figures, Adam, only a third of the masks in England in that stockpile were usable. And what Hallett is saying is, you know, with the usual sort of like, you know, caveated language, we need to get better at doing this next time, because we cannot be in a situation where, you know, they were running out of masks by the end of March 2020, 4 weeks, maybe 5, 6 if you're being generous, into a pandemic, a stockpile that was meant to last, you know, best part of 3-4 months. So that was, I think, a key mistake that was made here, and another reason why we need to improve for next time.
Just thinking back to what you said about the VIP lane and how no one can work out how it came into being. And I'm just thinking back to an episode of Newscast we did a few months ago. It was actually a little mini series about the Home Office and why is it so difficult to make a success of running the Home Office. And one of the things that I remember from those episodes was just the sheer amount of correspondence Home Secretaries and Ministers get from MPs about their own constituents or things that MPs are particularly interested in. And so I just wonder if it was part of that culture that we have at Westminster, where MPs do have quite a direct line into ministers in a way that to outsiders might seem a little bit cozy or weird. And I wonder if the VIP lane just came from that sort of culture.
I don't want to be overly charitable to the government in charge at the time, but when you read the report, I don't think the creation of that lane she's suggesting for a second was anything to do, you know, there wasn't some nefarious kind of plot to create it and enrich people. But in a way, that's not the main point. The main point was how it was perceived by the public and the confidence, therefore, that the government's actions and MPs' actions, ministers' actions took a hit because of this kind of thing. And I do think it's one of those things when we talk about when I talk to people at the pandemic now, people, in a way, a lot of people want to forget, don't they? I think we all do. But when you bring up PPE, that is a subject. That VIP lane is one that comes back again and again. I think it played into, the Johnson government and all these accusations around Partygate and so on. That kind of almost formed the background to some of that.
Interesting. So this was the halfway point, at least in terms of the reports from the different modules. So there's 5 more to go. What's the next one? So
we've got one on, which will be really interesting actually, on the care home sector, which is due in the autumn, and one also on the impact on children, in particularly the education system. So I think both of those will be interesting, fascinating for their own kind of reasons. And then we go forward to talk about the economy and the wider impacts on society as well. So some way left to go, but I think the bulk of kind of the actual direct impact on health, I think, has now pretty much been covered.
And talking of covering health and big health stories that affect a lot of people, have you been doing the explosive diarrhea epidemic in America?
I mean, my wife was talking to me about that the other day, saying how horrific it looks. But yeah, I don't like that. It's caused by a microscopic worm, right?
Parasite.
I really don't personally like the idea of this very much, but...
And you've been doing the COVID inquiry today, so you've had a good reason to not cover explosive diarrhea.
Yeah, I await the job of being sent out to cover explosive diarrhea over the coming weeks, should it come across this side of the Atlantic.
Jim, thank you very much.
Cheers, Adam. Thank you.
Now, there's more proof that the ceasefire deal between the US and Iran is not really working. There have been Iranian attacks on ships in the Strait of Hormuz and US assets stationed in the Gulf in other countries. And the US has also hit back at Iran to reduce their ability to attack commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. This has had some knock-on consequences for the world economy and for the UK economy, which will be the subject of a big speech tonight by the UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves, who's doing her annual dates with the city at Mansion House. So let's try and draw all these strands together, because here in the studio to help me out is the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack. Hi, Simon.
Hello, Adam.
Now, you're going to the Chancellor's Mansion House speech tonight. Why are you not in your black tie and tails already?
Well, it's business attire only.
Oh, okay.
Which is a good job, because I've been told the air conditioning is not working.
Okay.
So this is a 100-year-old building sweltering in the city with 800 people of the great and good from the financial district to go and listen to what is probably, almost certainly, the Chancellor's swan song.
Okay.
So that looks like a fantastic, enticing prospect.
Yeah, well, thank you for stopping off here on the way. And also joining us from Washington, D.C. is Caitríona Perry. Hi, Caitríona.
Hi, Adam. How are you? Hi, Simon.
Hello there.
So, Caitríona, just bring us up to date with this exchange of fire between the US and Iran overnight.
Yeah, exactly. So last night, the US carried out its 3rd consecutive night of strikes on Iran, again saying it was doing so in retaliation for strikes on some commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran then retaliated, hitting back on US military bases and installations in neighbouring countries, UAE, Kuwait and Bahrain, as it's been hitting for the last few nights in retaliation there. So things very much in an escalatory place. While those strikes were ongoing, the president was in the Oval Office doing something else, but he took a few questions from reporters and said that the US would continue to hit Iran, as he said, very hard. He was very critical of the people that his team have been negotiating with in Iran, but he did say that he felt a deal was still possible. However, he repeated what he had kind of posted on Truth Social during the day, which was that the US was going to be in control of the Strait of Hormuz, that it was its guardian, was the word he used, and that he was going to impose this 20% tax essentially on all cargo ships coming through the Strait of Hormuz. I can tell you just at this exact moment, the president has just posted on Truth Social to say that he's going to actually replace that 20%, as he calls it now. I'm just going to read it out because he's literally just posted it this minute. He says, I have decided to replace the 20% United States reimbursement fee, this is what he was calling it, with trade and investment deals that the various Gulf states will be making into the United States. Those investments will be massive in capitals, but at the same time, extraordinarily good for them and their future. As everyone is aware, we have the largest dollar investment into the United States of any country in history, but these new investments will make that number even bigger. We'll see factories, plants and equipment pour into the United States at historic level, creating additional millions of high-paying American jobs. America is winning again, he says, winning like never before. The days of Iran killing hundreds of thousands of people, including 52,000 protesters, are over. And most importantly, Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, he says. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So a lot of words in there, but not a whole pile of detail, really, in terms of, you know, how do you replace what he was going to put in place, that 20% fee, with suddenly countries instead being required to make investments into the US and create jobs and build factories. Seems like there's a bit of a disconnect there. All of this hasn't come into force yet. Of course, it's due to come into effect at what will be 9 p.m. in the UK later on. So many hours for potential wriggle room between now and then.
Simon?
I could just tell you that in response to that, oil prices have fallen a bit because people were obviously concerned about a 20% toll in the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of oil and gas goes through there. So once again, we have this kind of bouncing around of oil prices. When at the height of the conflict, for example, Brent crude was like at nearly $120 a barrel. It then fell back to 70, even below 70, when it looked like it was all going to be smoothed out. It jumped again over the last 3 days to 85. So it's been bouncing around in a very wide range. But those comments that Caitríona just told us about have seen it fall again, because it looks like, as people expect and as they've come to expect with Donald Trump, he says one thing and then slightly dilutes it. And, that rather amorphous announcement about investment deals seems to the rest of the world a lot better than 20% toll on every ship going through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, I just always remember that time a few months ago, Simon, you and I were talking about the price of a barrel of oil. And I said, rhetorically, why should I care? Because I don't have a car and I'm not an oil trader. And you said, yeah, but do you eat food?
Yes.
So it's just sort of really good reminder of why that price trickles down to all of us.
It's incredibly
eventually.
pervasive. It gets into the price of just about everything. Even stuff that doesn't have oil extracts or products in it, like fertilizer, sulfur, etc., etc. Just getting stuff to your local supermarket requires gasoline if you're in the US, oil. And remember, Trump is very aware that he's got midterm elections coming up, and the US motorist, both domestic and business-wise in their trucks, are incredibly oil price sensitive.
And also, Caitríona, I can just see what might have happened overnight is that Trump makes this threat of putting a 20% toll charge on top of 20% of the world's oil. That's a big stick. But then I can imagine lots of his Gulf allies looking at their economies and the consequences of that and saying, actually, why don't we give you a nice carrot instead? We'll do some trade deals and promise some inward investment to the US.
Yeah, I think that was definitely playing in here. But also, I was speaking to a few people in the US military and the Navy overnight, and they were saying what the president was proposing, before we get into the sort of international law question about taxes and tolls on shipping like that, which is a big one. They were saying militarily or practically, it would be incredibly difficult to actually enforce what he was talking about doing. The other part of that 20% was this full blockade on Iranian ports. That, according to military experts, is, relatively straightforward and something that could be done and, of course, was in force at the beginning of this whole conflict. But when you're trying to put a toll in place and what people were notionally paying for, of course, was safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. These military folks telling me that's almost impossible to guarantee at this point because of what's coming at them from Iran, they said. And mostly at this point, that is now drones and what they described to me as fairly cheap to make artillery, but plentiful and quite difficult to defend against while you're trying to make sure there are no casualties and that those ships aren't impacted in any way. So I think there may have been a bit of a kind of realization of, what we're proposing here practically is actually quite difficult, as well as just grossly unpalatable to so many people, as you say there.
And Simon, as we've learned, the appetite for risk amongst the international shipping world is very low. So they do not want to be transiting to the Strait of Hormuz if there's drones and ammunition going in both directions.
No, I mean, on a number of levels. One is obviously the safety and well-being of their crews, which most of the shipping lines are not prepared to compromise. And secondly, there's the business of insurance premiums as well. Obviously, the more the activity, the more hostility you've got in those straits, the higher those insurance premiums get. So it just cost laden on cost. And as we said, it's pervasive. And what we've seen is government borrowing costs have been going up around the world as a result of this, including in the US, particularly in the UK, which has seen more reliant on the price of oil, more sensitive to oil and gas movements. And that's pushed, for example, the benchmark 10-year borrowing cost, what the UK government can borrow for 10 years, above 5% for a bit today. That, of course, is an extra headache for our incoming Prime Minister, because the more expensive borrowing is, the more it adds to the debt interest bill, which is already at £100 billion plus a year.
And also, I'm just thinking back a few months ago when Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, was on Laura Kay's Sunday show, and he said, look, even if there is peace in the Gulf, there'll be 8 months of economic disruption afterwards. And I sort of took that as almost like a thing to put in my calendar, but you realize that's a very naive way of looking at it, because this ceasefire process has been much bumpier and backwards and forwards than that sort of calculation assumes.
Yeah, I actually think that was an overestimate a little bit in terms of how long it would take, and I think we saw that when we saw the emergence of a kind of deal here, and we saw prices go from 100 to down to 70 and below. People are always looking forward, and if they genuinely believe that there's a sustainable cessation of hostilities, then oil prices, natural gas prices can snap back pretty quickly. Obviously, that takes some time to work through the snake of global supply chains, but people take confidence from that. But at the moment, it feels like there's been a bit of, the opposite of crying wolf here. It's been crying sheep, and the sheep never arrives.
Yeah, it's strange that phrase never caught on.
You heard it here first.
I just invented it.
Yeah,
I'm regressing it already.
Yeah, it's going straight into Wikipedia. But Caitríona, I wonder, though, if this just shows maybe there was a bit of suspension of disbelief when Donald Trump and the Iranians did that initial ceasefire deal. And actually, once we all started reading it and looking at it, it was like, oh, yeah, this deal is very vague and quite woolly. And the kind of more long-term settlement will be really what matters between these two countries.
Absolutely. And, that's what a lot of experts said at the time, particularly talking to some of the people who were involved in the Obama deal, the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, saying this language is incredibly vague and you can't, this is essentially a contract. That's what peace deals are, right? And you wouldn't do a commercial contract. You wouldn't buy a house, buy a car, whatever, without going over the fine print, measuring every single word, making sure all sides knew what every word and every phrase and every sentence meant. And, expert negotiators looking at that memorandum of understanding immediately kind of got out the highlighter and said, vague bit. And nobody had tremendous faith in it from the outset. It's been rocky since the beginning. I mean, how many times have we used the word fragile about that ceasefire? And essentially it's over now with this, many nights of exchanging of fire. President Trump has notified the Congress here that he has, officially restarted military action in Iran. So that essentially renders it null and void from this point of view here in the US as well. And it began life as a question over squashing and removing Iran's nuclear capabilities, and it's now become very focused on this powerful weapon, if you like, that didn't even exist before the beginning of the war, which was the Strait of Hormuz. Now, there's a time frame on that largely. We've already seen countries and companies trying to find workarounds to not come through the Strait of Hormuz. That will take some time. So there is kind of a clock on how powerful that weapon is for Iran. But right now, that's what everything seems to be centered on, including from the president and the administration here. And we're hearing less about the nuclear capabilities and more about the strait.
But Simon, the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is sort of open, sort of closed, sometimes a war zone, sometimes not, is probably just something that the world economy is going to have to adjust to for the rest of time now, isn't it?
Well, and we've seen actually the UAE, United Arab Emirates, just in the last 24 hours, announced plans to develop a new port, a new way of getting their oil in and out of the Gulf by placing a new port, this side, if you like, the safe side of the Strait of Hormuz. Now that will cost tens of billions to build, but I think at some point people have realised, the economies of so many of these countries rely on that strait. They can't afford to be held hostage on that for their long-term economic, capabilities. So I would expect, that to be other initiatives like that, new pipelines, new ports, new whatever, people saying, you know what, I don't care what it costs, we can't be going through this for the rest of the time.
Caitríona, how is it looking politically, domestically for Donald Trump? Simon mentioned the midterms, which are in November. So actually getting quite close, really.
Yeah, here from a political context, those midterms, those elections in November are very close. When this war began back in February, we were saying, how long is the road before people start getting very anxious about how much it's costing to fill up their cars, heat their homes, etc., etc. That is now really pinching President Trump. This has been an unpopular war from the outset. Poll after poll has shown the American people do not support him. There might be some support for the idea of making sure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon, but in terms of, how it's being handled, how the president is sort of prolonging things, people feel that he's dealing with it quite badly and poorly, and each poll that comes out is lower and lower support. And you speak to Republicans who are on the campaign trail or their strategists, and they will say, we can't outrun this. There isn't enough road between now and the midterm elections. And to the point Simon was making earlier about how long it will take for markets and prices to recover, that's way past November at this point, even if everything was resolved tomorrow, which is highly, highly unlikely. So the president is in trouble over that. Economic prices, cost of living, his commitment, as we've talked about so many times, to not get the US involved in forever wars, to not be involved in things in other countries. This is now turning into months and months and months. The president last night again saying, oh, well, we were in Vietnam for 19 years. We've only been a few months here. Will also send shockwaves through Republicans kind of, oh my gosh, don't talk about this in terms of years. But the fact of the matter is the talks are essentially going nowhere. That's what the president has said and what others have said as well. And there's nothing clearly on the table. There's no clear way out of this. And they have to focus on diplomacy. But that's had limited gain to date.
Simon, I started off by joking about you going to Mansion House, where you're going to be sweltering with the Chancellor tonight. Do you want to say anything about the British economy?
Well, look, it's interesting. This will be probably the Chancellor's last address to the great and the good of the financial of the City of London. And there are two different feelings about this as she approaches what is likely to be a swan song. One is she got a bit unlucky. If you go back to the first quarter of this year, growth was pretty good. Interest rates are on their way down. Inflation was in the right trajectory. Business and consumer sentiment was actually beginning to pick up. Things were going
we're
well.
turning the corner, was the government
Turning
message.
the corner, and there was some evidence that was true. Then, of course, you get February 28th, this kicks off, and that's what I would call a stagflation bomb. It stagnates growth, it raises inflation, it raises government borrowing costs. Everyone starts seeing higher prices at the pumps in the US, in the UK, elsewhere, filter through down to everything. And so whatever progress and any feel-good factor that was creeping into the UK economy got extinguished by that. And now some people would say she's a bit unlucky about that. Other people say that she's the author of her own downfall in a way, because she was complicit with the Prime Minister Keir Starmer in the fact that she talked about being very pro-business on the way in. Her first thing was to raise taxes very heavily on business. And the one thing people find unforgivable that I speak to is that she also said she was very unhelpfully downbeat about the economic outlook and tried to sort of say things are going to get worse before they're going to get better. And that, animal spirits, confidence, quite an important commodity in business terms, they can't forgive her for that. So she think they're not going to let her off the hook for that.
Yeah, and it sort of reminds me a bit of the Strait of Hormuz in that you could have this quite sketchy deal between the US and Iran, and all the diplomats and the foreign affairs experts are going, is this necessarily worth the paper it's written on? But for the economy and business, it's enough.
It's enough
to give them some confidence.
to believe that tomorrow might not be that much worse than today.
Yeah, so whereas a government then coming in and then talking everything down can have the opposite effect.
I mean, I should say her riposte to that would be, well, that's before I got in and I found that the finances were much worse than I thought. She would call it a £22 billion black hole, unfunded promises by the previous government, and therefore I had to shift. But people could have said that you could have done it in a way which gave us a bit more hope, and you were, as I say, unhelpfully downbeat, and that they do blame her for.
Simon, enjoy your dinner.
Thank you so much. Can't wait.
And Caitríona, enjoy any snacks or anything that you'll be having in the next few hours.
Thank you, and you.